Kia ora team, and welcome back to this video which is circling around how to create noughts and crosses using Python 3.4. So what we're going to cover in the video is we'll do a little bit of a review. We'll look at how we can add methods into the board class which will access and modify the board class variables and attributes. We'll look at adding functionality into our square clicked. So when we click on those squares, they'll switch from from blanks to X's and O's in the appropriate fashion, and we'll add some functionality to check if that game's been won after those X's and O's have been inserted. Okay, so this is what we ended up creating last time. On the right hand side we've got our UML diagrams, part of every good planner's planning. So on the left we've got the board with the attributes, and then the methods or the behavior down below. On the right, all of the little squares that we're going to end up creating for our noughts and crosses. So each square is going to be a square object, and that's what we've done over here in the code. So we've got our board class and our initializer. We go and create a frame, which is just useful if we wanted to add buttons below our game, but that we didn't want those buttons to conform to the layout of the game, or the board above it. We can separate those out. List of squares for storing those square objects, keeping track of the player's turn, whether or not the game's been won, the instruction label, where we just display whose turn it is, and whether the game has been won, and this one here, the create board, the ever important create board, which actually goes away and creates our square objects. See there, they're called to the class square, and the arguments, the information that's being passed to that class square. Okay, then we move through to class square, so it's getting obviously itself, it's getting the row position from that value, the column position from this col value, and the board object from that self value there. Yeah, because that self is within the board class, so refers to that board object. So when it comes through here, we just rename it to board object, and we use that board object to go into that class, so we can access the board class from class square, which is really, really useful, and we'll see lots of that in the upcoming video. So first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to start creating these accessor and modifier methods. So an accessor method is something that returns a value from this class, so it could return, for instance, whose turn it is by returning that player turn. And a modifier is a method that changes a variable or attribute. Okay, and why it's useful to have these is because if we just access these directly from all over our program, yeah, if we have to update anything relating to those variables, we have to update lots and lots of different places. Whereas if we access them via a modifier or an accessor method, we can just change the accessor method, and we have much more control and a lot more efficiency when it comes to updating our program. So the first method that we've got is, if we look at our UML diagram, we've got set instruction label. So that is a modifier, and it's called set instruction label. And I think you can guess what that does. It changes what's in my instruction label. Yeah. So it changes it to whatever is passed through to this modifier. So I need something coming in as well, which is useful. So the phrase that's going to come in is going to be set to that instruction label. So we can go self dot instruction label dot config text equals phrase. So next up in our fancy list, we've got check player turn. So let's have a look at what that's going to look like. Check player turn. And this is just an accessor. Yeah, all it does is return a value. It accesses, it doesn't change anything, it returns a value. So it's going to return this self.playerTurn value. So we use it when we want to find out whose turn it is. And it's pretty straightforward. That's it. So as I am wont to do, I've tested you, and I wonder if you saw my little mistake. Clearly it's not a mistake, but really it's a test. That shouldn't be an accessor, that should be a modifier, because it modifies what's going on. This is an accessor, it just returns a value. So we've got our two types just there. Now next in our list, we've done check player turn, we're doing increment player turn. So our next one. You notice that I'm going through and I'm commenting these, which is always a good idea, as we've discussed. So def inc player turn. Now I don't think we need to pass it anything. We're just going to increment the player turn and switch it to the other player. We're not. We don't have like 3 or 4, 5 or 6 players. We've only got 2, so it's either going to be player 1's turn or player 2's turn. So it's pretty simple in that way. So increment player turn. So we're going self.playerTurn. Yeah, and you can just do plus equals 1, and that will add 1 to whatever value player turn holds. And that's a nice little easy Python functionality that we love, we like, and you like. Okay. So we've got our accessor methods all set up. What we're going to do now is we're going down into this square clicked thing. Now this is being called when this event happens, when button 1 is pressed on my label, on that square. Okay, so tkinter is listening for that event, and when it happens, it goes and does this. Yeah, it goes and runs that code, that square clicked code. And it's important to remember we don't put the brackets after it, because that would kind of run that code there immediately. We're just leaving those brackets off, and that's the convention. So def square clicked gets self, like every method, and it also gets the event, and that event brings in some information, so we can, for instance, get the x and y coordinates of where that event happened, and further things like that. So there are lots of things that we can do there. Now, if you're also interested in about how we get different types of events, so here we've got button 1, which is a left mouse click. We can just do a little search on the internet, and I did a little search, and here are a list of some events that we can use. So you've got that button 1, button 2, blah, blah, blah. We've also got enter, the mouse pointer enters a widget, should be useful if we do rollovers, enter and leaving. We've got key widgets, so a user presses a particular key or any key, and things like that. So we've got a bit of flexibility there. So when button 1 is clicked, or sorry, when my square is clicked with button 1, it's going to go and do this code. What do we want this code to do? We can have a look at our pseudocode. Actually, it doesn't give us any help. We maybe should have discussed that. But let's jump into it. Let's just do a little bit of logical breakdown. So the button has been clicked, and the whole game is noughts and crosses. So we really want to change that label to reflect either a nought or a cross, depending on whose turn it is. So we really need to figure out whose turn it is before we do anything. So we need to check whose turn it is, and we just made an accessor for this very purpose. So we've got this accessor here, check player turn, okay, and we know player turn's an integer. It's either going to be even or odd, and that's going to be how we check whose turn it is. So evens will be x's and odds will be o's. So I would need to go, okay, if this returns an even, I'm going to do this line of code. I'm going to put in an X. If it returns odd, I'm going to do that. I'm going to put in a O, and I need to access this class, this board class, yeah, from my square class. Now, how can I do that, you may ask yourself. You're probably given the answer in that brain of yours as well, because we've talked about it before. In our square class, we passed through this board object. Remember, when we actually call square, it passes through the row, the column, and the object, the board object. Yeah, that comes through as well. And we can use that board object to access the board class, or access that board object. So I'm going to go if self.board object. Yeah, I'm referring to this this one here. If that self.board object dot, and this is how I dive down into that board object. I use that dot to go deeper into that board object, and I'm looking for a method. Yeah, and I'm going to go and get this check player turn method. Okay, if check player turn is divisible by 2, and if that remainder equals 0. So this is what we call a mod or modular. So it basically divides the value brought back by check player turn. Yeah, divides it by 2, and then gives us the remainder. So if that remainder equals 0, then we know it's an even number. If it doesn't equal 0, we know it's an odd number. So we can figure out whose turn it is using that method. And I think I should put a bracket in there. Now we're going to use this thing that we learned about. Remember the AND function. So AND, OR, and NOT. You remember using those. So if this is true and something else is true, we're going to do a line of code, or we're going to do what's below the if statement. So what else do we need to make sure of? We need to make sure, actually, that the game is still running, that the game hasn't been won. Yeah, because we've made remember up here we got self.game1 equals false, and that's what's going on with this commenting. To store game is one different type. Yeah, let's get rid of that. So self.game1, and we've got an accessor for this. So check game1, return self.game1. So I'm going to go self.board object, and I'm breaking my own rules here. I really should just copy and paste, because A, it's faster, and B, it's more accurate. Self.board, dive down into that object, and we're going looking for that check game1 method. So if this check player turn is giving a remainder of 0, so it's even, and the game is still winnable, i.e. the game has not been won, this is set to false. Yeah. So if that equals false, then we want to head on and actually do something, yeah, with that square that's just been clicked. I think the first thing that we want to do is probably update that text that's stored in the label. Okay, update the text that's stored in the label. We saw that we can do this up here using the config kind of functionality associated with the labels, tkinter labels. And that's probably what we're going to use down here. So I'll just give you a little minute to think about that. Pause and think about how you're going to do that. So let's see if you were right. So what we want to do first step, we've checked the player turn, and we've checked that the game hasn't been won, so we're going into this and we want to do what we want to. Well, we want to update the label. Okay, so we need to access that label. So how are we going to access that label? So it's self.square, yeah, there's our label, and what do we want to do to it? We want to configure it, so config, and just like we did up above, so config text equals phrase, so I'm just going to go config text equals, and with this case it's an X. Okay, and that should get the job done. Now, if you're a little bit unsure, like, where's he getting this config from? Like, what are the options here? In that kind of situation, you really need to go to the internet and do a little Google search, and it will tell you everything you need to know. Okay, the internet is a really good source of information, clarification points, figuring out the options of things. So it's really a resource you need to make use of. So what do we need to do after we've configured our text? What's our next step? Hope you enjoyed those musical interludes. So what are we going to do next? So we've set the text. Now we need to do a few things like, for example, if we come up to our modifiers, we've got increment player turn. That would be useful. We need to kind of get that player turn moving. So let's go self dot. And how do we access the other class? Use that board object dot. And we're diving down into the board object, and we're going increment player turn. Okay. So to do with the player turn, we also need to display whose turn it is. It was X's turn, and now it's O's turn, so we need to also update that instruction label. So we've got a modifier in here, set instruction label. So in the same way, we're going to use that self.board object, copy that down there, and set instruction label. And it takes one argument, which is the phrase that we're wanting to set it to. So we're going to set it to say it's O's turn, because you know it's O's turn. Gotta let them know. So we've got our if statement done, and the next stage is we're going to do an elif. Okay, it's going to follow the same sort of properties as this, but just the inverse of that. So we're checking the player turn and mod2 equal to 0. So in this case, it's going to be mod2 is not equal to 0. So if the player turn is an odd number, and we're still inside the game hasn't been won, we're going to configure the text to an O, because it was O that just clicked on our square. Self.board object increment player turn, that was good. Self.board object set instruction label, it's O's turn. Well, O just took a turn, so it's now back to X's turn. Okay, so these two, very, very similar, just the inverse of one another. One thing that we could do to improve this is a little bit of code commenting. So this square clicked method, what it does is it configures the text of the square when square has been clicked. Yep. Separate that out. Bring this down outside of the elif, but still inside square clicked. We're just going to do a next step. So once our user has clicked on a label and it's turned to either an X or an O, we need to check if they've won the game. Okay, so we're going to have to create up here in our board class, we're going to create a new method. We're going to call it game ended. Okay. I'm just going to go to pass at the moment. So down here, we need to check whether or not the game has ended. And this will run through a series of checks just to make sure that we haven't got a winning combination. So there aren't 3 X's in a row running horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, or there are no instances of 3 O's in a row. So if we bring it down here, we're still in square clicked. I'm going to go self.board, and I really should be using this guy and just copying and pasting. Okay, self.board object dot game ended, and we're just checking to make sure that that has or hasn't happened. So checking to see if the game has ended, someone has won. Okay, so that's what that's all about. So final step, we need to jump into this game ended thing and actually run through our matrix or our board and check if we've got any of those winning combinations. So we're going to have row 1 horizontal. I don't know why I made that capital. Horizontal. Yeah, that'll have a check. And row 2 horizontal, row 3 horizontal, and then row 1 vertical. Column 1 vertical, column 2 vertical, column 3 vertical, and then finally the 2 diagonals. We're going to have to do that for the X's and the O's. So there's quite a few checks that we need to do to see if this game has been won. Now there are more intelligent ways to do this. I'm going to show you a very simple and straightforward way, and I challenge you to improve upon it. So this first check that we're going to do, we are going to look into this list of squares and we're going to iterate through it. So we're going to check that first row. So the first row will be self dot, and as I suggested all of you do, I shall live by my own rules and self dot list of squares. Self dot list of squares position 0 should be the first object that was entered or created, the first square object, which will be the top left. So position 0. Now we're going to dive down into that object. So we've got hold of our object and then we're diving into it. So our square object, we're diving into it and we're looking for that square label. We want to know what text it's got, yeah. And if it's equal to an X, and then the row, the square next to it is equal to an X, and the square next to that is equal to an X, and we have 3 X's in a row on that first row, and we have a winner. Yep, so that's the kind of logic that we're following. So self list of squares position 0, so that first position dot square. So we're diving into the object and we're diving into that label object in here as well. And we're going to use a method called cget. Now remember we did our config down here where we configured our text to X. Well, cget is basically a configuration get. So anything that we can configure, we can also get the value of. So we can say, okay, I want to return the value of text. Going to check that out, and if it is equal to X, then that's a good thing. We're moving forward. Okay, so that's our first check. So there's a little error there just for your testing. Yeah, sure, for your testing. I have inadvertently not put that X in quote marks, so I wouldn't be comparing it to a string of characters. It would be comparing it to a variable called X, which of course doesn't exist, so we'll get an error. Now what we want to do is we want to do that so we've done it for our first position, and we want to do it for all of the positions in that row. So if I go and, hopefully remember about that. So if this is true and this is true, we're going to do some code down here. So that and thing's really useful, and we're just going to upgrade that to position 1 and X, and also that position 3, or sorry, it's position 2, third position. That also needs to be equal to X for this guy to have 1. So if he has 1, what do we want to do? So if that is true, what do we want to do? Another little test before we get too far. Now that should have been an if. So we need to come along to the end of this. Full column. So if. So what do we want to do if that is true? If that is equal to x, the first position is equal to x, and the second position is equal to x, and the third position is equal to x, then what do we want to do? We've won something here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this set instructions label, and so we go self dot set instructions label. The phrase will be x has won. Congratulations, X, well done. What do we want? What else do we need to do? So we've won the game. We kind of want to lock it down, yeah. And we've got a little thing that enables us to lock that down. We've got a variable up here called game1. Okay, so we want to set that to now to be true. Now we could access it directly. We've got an accessor that checks whether or not or returns its value. We could provide an accessor, so write a little method, and in fact we will. That's exactly what we'll do. I was going to be a bit lazy, but I'll live by my principles. So set game 1. Yeah. So self dot game 1 equals true. Okay, so now what we're going to do is come down here and go self dot set game 1. Yep, and it's going to go and set that to true. Now remember, when I'm referring to things within the class, yeah, I use that keyword self. Yeah, if I'm referring to these accessors, these modifiers outside of the class, I have to use an object. You remember that we did this board object to do access things like increment, player turn. Yep, so that board object says, or kind of helps point the computer at the correct class. It says, okay, you need to go to that board object class, yep, which is of type board, and have a look in there for this method called increment player turn. Yep. But if we're actually inside the class, then we can just go self dot set game 1 or whatever method we're looking for. It's all internal into the class. So now that we've got this done, we want to do it for the other horizontal rows, which I'm going to go ahead and do. So that's the 3 horizontal rows. Now we need to do the verticals, and that'll work in much the same way, but we will be using different numbers in here just to kind of make sure we're moving through the columns. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've done it for column 1 vertical, column 2 vertical, column 3 vertical. So it goes and checks 0, so that's that one there. Then it goes and checks position 3, so we've got 0, 1, 2, and 3, so it's checked there, and then it checks this one here, so 4, 5, and 6. So 0, 3, and 6 will give us that first column, and position 1, so 0, 1, we're onto the middle column, and 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so it's 1 and 4. So you can see the way that we're checking down through those columns, and we're going to move through and do the diagonals as well, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it. So here are my diagonals. I'm checking first 0, so that one there, then this one here, and this one here, and then the other diagonal checks up here, middle, and here. Okay, so we're looking for those 3 in a row for the X. Now these same checks need to be done, but for an O. Yeah, so we need to do the same checks to make sure that O hasn't won the game, and I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So here are the same checks, horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, but for O, I've changed the set instructions label to O has won, and that should be pretty much us. Now I encourage you to extend this game, change the display. Certainly my display is very, very, very crude. I'm just going to double check and make sure that we haven't got any errors that have crept in as we've moved along. We'll rectify those errors and then we should be gravy. So we do indeed have an error. So our game starts up and kind of runs okay, but if I click, nothing's happening. So I want to take you through how I tested this, or how I kind of narrowed in on what was going on. So nothing is updating when square is clicked. So what I first want to do is I want to just check whether or not we're actually getting into this this if statement. So I'm just going to check what's happening here. So as I go clicking around on my noughts and crosses, I should see that test popping up in my shell, but it is not, which makes me think that I'm not actually getting into this if statement. So I'm just going to take that test up a notch, and I'm going to chuck it in here. Just make sure that these squares actually, well, the squares are being created. So let's take it in here and see how that's looking. So we've got our game there. So if I click on that, you can see it's getting into that method as test one is coming up, but it is not actually getting into that if statement. So I would strongly suggest that I've got something wrong with my if statement. But what I can do is I can do a little check and see what's coming back with these values. So let's go self-double object mod 2. So that's the check that it's doing. It's checking whether player 2 divided by 2 has any remainder. So let's print that value out and just have a look. Yeah, that show over there. So you can see it's printing out test 1 and it's printing out 0. So that's never changing because it's never getting into that if statement, but it is printing it out. It's looking good, it's looking correct. So if I go self.board object check game 1 equals false, so check game 1, let's print that and just check what that's getting. So here we go. Okay, so it looks like we might have found an issue here. So we're getting our test 1 that's being printed. It's printing out 0, which is the player turn. And then we're getting this bound method board, check game 1, blah, 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 at 0x, etc., etc. So it's not actually printing, it's not actually returning the correct value. It's not actually returning false or true like I expected it to. So something's going amiss in here, and I wonder if you can figure out what that might be. So pause the video and see if you can figure it out, and then in about 3 seconds I'm going to tell you what the answer is. So pause. So hopefully you paused and had a little think about that. Now we are going self.board.object check game 1. Now this is an accessor method, but I haven't included any brackets afterward. So let's try that with some brackets to signify that that is indeed a method. And let's see what we get. So blank, and now I'm getting the correct response. I'm getting false, like I expected. Okay, so that I think is our error. So I'm going to remove that test print statement, and I'm going to go in here and add in these here, and let's check and make sure. There we go. And things seem to be working a bit better, and X has won the game. So everything seems to be working well. I'll leave you to test it more rigorously, and if there are any things that you feel need to be added in terms of input checking or anything like that, you can do that, and that will be a good extension. You could also extend the way it's displayed. This is really crude, as I mentioned earlier, and it's designed to be so you can extend and improve upon it. So good luck with that. I hope this has helped you with your assignments, your programming in general, and if you've got any questions, you can leave a comment. Possibly I've enabled comments, I'm not sure, but good luck anyway.